Turn back now. I have terrible predictions for you. And that is, I have figured it all out. The remake is different at the end because the remakes are not just a retelling of the original story. No. They're doing a rebuild of Evangelion. Now, for those who don't know, Evangelion is this very influential Japanese anime franchise that essentially rebooted itself in the mid-2000s and then finished about like last year after having that last movie take, 300 years to be complete. What essentially happens in that franchise is you have the original franchise, you have the movie conclusion of the franchise, and then a few years later they made these movies that were essentially a sequel disguised as a remake, because halfway through they totally jumped the shark from the original franchise and go in a totally different direction. Essentially solving some plot lines and taking and reiterating the message of the original in a more positive note, One of the things is that Neon Genesis Evangelion was one of those very influential franchises that influenced a lot of little things just because of its sheer presence in pop culture, especially in Japan. Final Fantasy VII, its original game, ends, and then they made a whole bunch of little spin-offs and whatever the fuck, right? Then they announced they were gonna make these shiny new remakes with high fidelity graphics, and that's all cool, right? And they were gonna split it up into 3 parts, and people started noticing that there's these changes, there's these new elements of plot introduced, there's this new stuff going on, right? And well, I called it very early on when I knew the ending was different. Sephiroth already knows things he's not supposed to know yet. Stuff is happening out of order. This is just rebuild of Evangelion again. My brother didn't believe me because he was an ignorant soul who just did not know yet. But I could totally prove it 100%. And that is that they're making evercrisis. Yes, them confirming and showing evercrisis confirms to me that this is all Evangelion. Now, let me explain this without sounding like a complete madman. evercrisis is a remake of the original Final Fantasy VII and all the little spin-off things they made afterwards, right? All contained into this episodic or like into one game essentially. And very importantly, evercrisis follows the same stylization of the original. The characters within it look like chibis, and then you have the turn-based combat where everyone looks like they're fully rendered out cells, which is very similar to the PlayStation 1 version, right? It didn't have the technology back then, everything was more stylized, and with this evercrisis thing, they're also bringing back the stylization. But why are they releasing 7 again, you might be saying? The evercrisis 7 is the actual 7 from the PS1. It's gonna follow the same plotline and everything else. What I imagine is that at the end of Tales of Berseria, or whatever the fuck the last one was called, Bahamut of Cerberus, we will get an extra little chapter. And this little extra chapter will explain this one little thing that doesn't really make sense, but then actually is important for the remake movies. I mean, the remake games, I'll explain the timeline very easily here. It'll be evercrisis, which is the original timeline essentially, right? Then it'll be Crisis Core, the remake they're doing. I'll talk more about that in a second. Then there'll be Final Fantasy Remake Part 1, Rebirth Part 2, and the third one will be called Resurrections because I predict that Cloud will die at the end of the 7th game, and or Barret. It has to do with them subverting expectations, but not just subverting it, they're changing. It's a different story. It's going to go in a totally different direction, right? It's not just subversion. Don't worry, we're not going to Last Jedi it. It's going to be Evangelion, believe me. Way better. Crisis Core is this little prequel movie that follows this other character we saw at the end of the remake of 7, right? Now, this character is supposed to be dead, and therefore, not alive. So how is he here? Well, that's going to be explored in that game, but that makes that game also the earliest point in this timeline. Earliest point in the game is somehow going to be connected to evercrisis. Whatever happens at the end of evercrisis that reboots the universe or makes Sephiroth go back into time somehow, project his consciousness back into the early days or whatever, that's going to happen in Crisis Core. And then for the rest, Crisis Core is going to pretty much be a remake of the original Crisis Core, except probably with some more influences from the new reboot franchise, right? Then Remake 1 happens, which already diverts from the story, and then Remake 2 will divert from the story at a certain point. Most things will be adapted, but I imagine that the most important, quote-unquote, gaming moment that people remember from 7, Aerith's death, will not be in it. For the simple reason that Zack's alive, therefore Aerith and him can kind of have this happy ending. They're changing the timeline. So I imagine at some point, the interference from past memories or whatever will happen, and Cloud will sort of get this nightmare of Aerith being stabbed, and at the moment where Aerith is at the altar or whatever, he'll jump in front of her, push her out of the way, keeping her alive, and getting stabbed by Sephiroth, who will laugh maniacally or whatever, because that's his entire deal. Sephiroth's deal is to thrust his skinny katana up Cloud's midriff or whatever, That's his goal. more about that in a second. What this will do is at the end of Rebirth, that's what the second part's going to be called, Cloud's going to be resurrected by the end, and or is going to stay dead, and we play as Zack at the beginning of 3, essentially mirroring Kingdom Hearts 2, where we play as another character to revive our main character, which might be because the Cloud we see at the end of the RE7 Part 1 is maybe a second Cloud. But this is a totally different theory. That the timelines are divulging. We're not going to talk about that. No, it's too much. What's Sephiroth's deal in all this? In the original, he wants to become God and take over the universe for his mom, right? In this one, it's Sephiroth's endgame. Him coming back at the end of all the little like side stories that happened around 7 will accumulate into the ultimate rebuild of Ava 4 movie, which is essentially the third part of the game. I will say it's going to be called Resurrections because it will follow from Rebirth, where Cloud gets resurrected, and then Sephiroth will want to resurrect his full self too, but that won't happen because they'll probably kill him, and to keep him dead, they'll do some weird shit where even the memory of Sephiroth will have to be forgotten. If they can forget the total, if they can totally annihilate the memory of him, of everyone, kick out his influence, then he will be not only dead, he'll be dead, forgotten, and beyond infinity into the void or whatever the hell, right? And then at the end of it all, Cloud and Tifa will have hot sex, but we'll never be allowed to see it because this franchise is more focused on Cloud's abs. That's the rules. Barrett may or may not die to replace another tragic death. I have no idea. Aerith and Zack will live forever after, and they'll walk off into the distance, and then I can forever shut up about this franchise. I didn't even play the first one. Did you know that? But that, is all just a theory. A game theory! Thanks for watching.